Well, it seems to be a game that's going to be as iconic for 2020 as isolation's going to be. I'm talking about Animal Crossing. Everybody loves it, everybody's playing it, everybody's raving about it. And I happen to have an Animal Crossing fan in my ranks. My eldest son is crazy about it. And clearly it doesn't discriminate with age because he's 21. So his little brother and I put our heads together and this is the design we came up with for his 21st birthday cake. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make the house, the topper, the trees, the garden, the fence, and how to cover the board. But if you'd like to know how I made those toppers, I'll put a link in the description below and you can find out how I did it there. And I will just warn you that if anything could have gone wrong with this cake, it went wrong and I included it in the footage. So I hope you enjoy that too. I've jabbered long enough, so let's get on with it. So to make my Animal Crossing cake, I used 3 7-inch square cakes and then I went ahead and made a template for the base of the cake using some foam core. With that template, I then cut my cakes to size using all the bits and pieces so there is no wastage here. I then went ahead and used that template as my baseboard, attaching it to a setup board with a bit of ganache, put a bit of ganache on the top to secure the cake, and then started stacking and filling my layers. Sort of putting it together like a jigsaw puzzle. And yep, I'm looking smart by using my template, but this is where everything went completely wrong. So I continued to build the cake knowing full well that something looked a little bit off. So you'll see what happens. Can you see right here? There's supposed to be an overhang on the roof. Can you see an overhang? Because I can't. And I couldn't then either. But did I stop? No, I just kept going. I mean, Janine, stop! This is not right. You can see it's wrong. Oh dear. It wasn't a good day. So what I ended up doing was removing the entire roof, which of course meant I had to do another complete bake, which took me hours, which set me back, but we got there in the end. So what I did was just use the rectangle base and went ahead and ganached that nice and smoothly. Let's try this again, shall we? So once that was done, what I did was plan B, was made a second template for the roof. I went ahead and stacked and filled that exactly the same as I had my base tier. I then took a very small template that I placed on top to use as a guide. Then using those guides, I cut on an angle to make my roof shape, cutting from the edge of the top template to the edge of the base. I did that on both sides and at either end. I'll leave a link in the description where you can get your hands on the templates that I used. Just follow them, not like me. Nice roof shape. Then I took my top template off and put a little bit of ganache under it, placed it back on and used the top template and the base template as a guide to do my ganaching. As you can see, I'm taking my scraper, holding it against the side of the top template and the side of the base template to get that nice angle. Going in and getting those nice sharp edges and everything was looking hunky-dory. So once the roof was done, I had to make a cute little arch for the front of the house. So with some excess cake, I made it into a bit of a rectangle, took my arch template that you'll also be able to get your hands on and cut them into an arch shape. Then I just sandwiched those pieces together with a bit of white chocolate ganache to use as glue. Now don't attach this to the baseboard because we need to ganache both front and back of this piece, which I'm doing now. I came in on this angle just to give you an idea of how tall this piece was, not even an inch. Very, very small piece of cake. And pop that aside. Okay, now let's start assembling this. So I've taken a 12mm thick MDF board and I've placed my first cake onto that board, sitting further to the back than to the front because we need to add decoration. I'm using my quilting ruler to measure the sides and the front and back of the cake. And then I rolled out some ivory fondant and cut to those measurements. We're gonna panel this baby. Once your panels are ready, it's time to attach them to the cake, which I did with just a little bit of water, and I found the easiest way to put them on was also with my quilting ruler. I just smooth them out a little bit with my acrylic smoother, and then went ahead with my craft knife and cut off the excess. I like holding a metal scraper against those edges so I can save my fingers and get a nice clean cut. Of course, I then went ahead and did the same to the front and to the back. We don't need a top on this cake, so we don't have to worry about that. Smoothed it out, and now this part is completely optional. If you want to hide those seams from where you've panelled the cake, just take a little bit of fondant, the same coloured fondant that you've used to panel the cake with, mix it with a bit of water, and then with a palette knife, put that paste onto the seam, scraping it off, and we're seamless. Now it's time to dowel the cake. Now because the roof isn't too heavy, I've decided to use bubble tea straws for the dowels. So I popped one in, marked it with an edible marker where I needed to cut it, and then cut the other 3 accordingly. I put the first 3 in and then took that little arch piece, placed it at the front, and just placed the 4th dowel a little further back, and you'll see why shortly. And this is where I mucked up again when everything was going so well. I decided I want the roof taller. The roof doesn't need to be taller, the template doesn't say it needs to be taller, so why make the roof taller? Urgh. Anyway, I made the roof taller with some modelling chocolate that I promptly removed later on anywho. You're a fool, Janine, you're a fool. Huh. Gush. Anyway, I'm now covering my too tall roof with some terracotta coloured fondant. I'm just laying it over the top and pulling out the pleats just like you do with any other cake and smoothing that on. I cut off the excess and use my smoothers to make it nice and smooth. Don't be too precious about this part. We are covering this with other elements later, but a good foundation leads to a good finish. Roof's done. And now to cover the little archway, which I'm covering in the same colour fondant that I panelled the house in. This one, as you can see, is pretty simple. Ready to rock and roll. Now what I've done here is just placed my top cake on the base cake and then placed my archway against where I'm going to have that sit on the house. Made a small mark on either side of the archway into the base of the roof. Then with my craft knife, I cut a small section out of the bottom so that the archway sits a bit more flush against the cake. You can see here I'm just cutting a small strip out, using my Dresden tool to remove any excess cake just at the bottom there. And then quite aggressively with my craft knife, cutting a little bit of the foam core off the base also. Don't worry too much about banging your roof up here. Like I said, we're going to be covering it with other elements anyway. Now we can assemble it properly. So I put a little bit of ganache on the top of the base of the house and placed the roof on top. A little bit of ganache on the front, and now I can place that archway up without it banging against the roof. Give it a little bit of a press, and for some added security, I put a smoother at the back of the cake and pushed a long skewer through the archway. Cut off the excess, and then with that excess bit, just pushed the rest of the skewer through. Give it a smooth and it's ready to decorate. First thing I have to do is make a roof for the archway, so I've just taken some of that terracotta coloured fondant and cut it into a long rectangle and place that on the top of the arch. Now you have no idea how long it took me to figure out how to do the tiles on the roof. This cake was an absolute nightmare, and it shouldn't have been. If I'd planned ahead and stuck to the plan, it would have been fine. Anywho, this is how I did it. So I took another long piece of terracotta coloured fondant and scored it to make it look a bit more thatched with my Dresden tool. I took a brick impression mat and just impressed that entire row of fondant. Then with my mini pizza wheel, I just cut out single lines of that impressed fondant. Just like that, quite a few, as you can see. With a little bit of water, I started attaching it to the roof, very slightly overlapping each piece, very slightly. I was overlapping far too much in the beginning. It ended up looking bulky and horrible, and that's why I had to keep trying and trying. But this way worked the best. It looks like it's going to take forever, but it really didn't take that long. It wasn't too bad. Up the front, all the way to the top, and then I just cut the excess off the side. For the archway, I just took a piece of that same impressed fondant without cutting out the pieces and laid that over the top. And then of course I went ahead and did the sides in exactly the same way. And once it was done, I wanted to neaten up those edges a little bit, so I took some more of that terracotta coloured fondant, rolled it into a long snake shape, and just placed it up onto the seams of the roof with a little bit of water. Every corner seam and on the top. As you can see, I was getting cold. I had my flight jacket on here. It was freezing. Now time to hit it with some colour, out of focus. How awesome. I added a little bit of ivory for starters, then went in with some orange, and to finish it off, some darker brown. Made a complete mess of the cake, so in hindsight, I probably should have wrapped the base of the cake, but I managed to clean it up and it didn't look too bad in the end. Now on to covering the boards. So I'm attaching a piece of green fondant at the front because it's a bit of an awkward shape. We're going to do this in panels also. I just cut around the front edges of that house and give it a little bit of a smooth. Cutting nice straight sides there, and then cut the excess off. Then I take another panel of the same coloured fondant, attach it with a little bit of piping gel, and overlap that side piece to the front piece. Cut off the excess, and where they overlap, I've just taken my ruler and cut a nice straight line. Remove that base piece, remove the piece underneath the side piece, and smoothed it together. Cut off the excess, and then I went ahead and did exactly the same on the other side and on the back. Cake board is covered. So now I wanted to make the brick edging for the base of the house. To do this, I took some terracotta and grey coloured fondant and mushed them together. It's a technical term, I just made it up, and it is now marbled. I lightly dusted my board and rolled that out, and then using my brick impression mat once again, I impressed that all the way up. Now to get the measurements for how tall I wanted my edging to be, I used my handy dandy acrylic rulers and picked the size that I liked. I'll put a link in the description where you can buy these. And then I used the size I liked and cut out strips of that brick edging. I then just attached that to the base of the cake with a little bit of water. I did do it in pieces and it didn't really matter, they matched up and looked lovely. All the way around the perimeter. And that was that. Now this part I didn't show on film, I'm sorry, I just made a thicker square of the same coloured fondant that I'd impressed with brick, and then 2 thinner pieces, one slightly wider that I placed at the base and one thinner at the top to make stairs. Now I had to make the timber plinths for either side of the archway, so I decided on using modelling chocolate for this because it's nice and rigid. I took my Dresden tool after rolling it into a thick snake and made it look a bit wood grainy. And then I took a thick skewer and measured it up against the side of the house, making sure the pointy end was long enough to stick into the top of that archway. I cut pieces of the modelling chocolate to fit those skewers and pushed the skewer straight through, leaving the pointy end at the top. And then I took some ivory gel food colour and painted up each plinth to make it look like timber. Wiped a little bit of the excess off. We've got our timber plinth. Of course I did that twice. Then with that pointy end sticking up, I just pushed it up into the archway area to make it stay. Tidy that up where I've messed up the paintwork, of course. And there you go. Now I'm adding some nice edging to the roof of the cake using an ivory coloured fondant that I cut using that little machine in the back there. I used the fettuccine cutter on my pasta machine and it was the perfect width. I used that to edge the archway firstly and then the entire base of the roof. Using my ruler to make sure it's nice and level. Now I've taken a piece of grey fondant that I've squished into a bit of a, well, brick shape, and I'm using my sharp edge cutter to sharpen the edges of that brick shape. I then cut it on an angle and using a little bit of water attached it to the roof for the chimney that you don't see in the end, but if I knew it wasn't there, I'd be disturbed. So it's there. Now let's make the door. So I've rolled out a piece of fondant the same colour as the house and I've cut out the door from my template and I'm rolling over that template onto the fondant to make an impression. I then use my sharp edge and my craft knife to cut that shape out. This was a bit of trial and error also, but I found the best way to do this was to use my Dresden tool to make the impressions of the shapes that were on the door into the fondant. Cheating a little bit with the window, I have a window mould that I'm pressing some of the same coloured fondant into, squishing it in, making sure it's nice and catching all of that impression. Pull it out, and then using my sharp edge, I cut around the edges. I made 2 of those, and then I painted them up. Once again, just using some ivory food gel colour. I went in lighter with the windows here, however I ended up changing them later on because what did I do? I looked at my reference picture, like I should have been, the whole time. And they were black, so I made them black later on. I just attached the windows and the door with some water. And that's where the other one went, right on the side. To make the little door handle, I just rolled a piece of white fondant into a little ball and squished that into position and coloured that in with some gold luster dust mixed with alcohol. There's also a little light above the door, so I've rolled a piece of grey fondant into a teardrop shape, cut the base off that and then rolled a small piece of white fondant into a tapered teardrop, tapered at either end. Squashed that underneath the grey piece to make it one, and our little light was done. I then just attached that with a little bit of water right above the door. Excuse the ivory food colour all over my arms. Now this is a little bit of a fiddly bit. I've never played Animal Crossing, I've got no idea what the purpose is, but they have these little signposts at the front of the houses. So this is some modelling chocolate that I'm cutting into tiny little pieces, putting a cocktail stick a little way into them, and then cutting those 2 side posts a little shorter. With the longer piece, I'm placing that over the top as the top of the signpost and cutting it to size. Now I'd made a tiny little rectangle of fondant that I put 2 little holes in, and then I went ahead and painted them all. Went back and repainted the signpost darker because it needed to be darker. With tiny little pieces of modelling chocolate, I've made loops into those holes on the little sign. Yeah, it's fiddly. And they were ready to go. Now I wanted to make a fence for the back of the house, so I'm using modelling chocolate once again because it does stand up, it's nice and rigid, and I've used a wood grain impression mat this time to impress the modelling chocolate. Using my handy dandy ruler again, I'm making strips out of that modelling chocolate. Then I cut those strips in half and used my blade to just cut little points at the top to make pickets. Using my ruler again, I've cut another strip of modelling chocolate to put the pickets onto. And using the ruler again to space the pickets, I make sure that they're all evenly spaced. Modelling chocolate sticks really well to modelling chocolate, so I didn't need to use water on this. I'm quickly going to rush through this bit because it's the same as all the other bits. I went ahead and quickly gave that a go over with some gel colour to make it look like timber. Now on to the iconic tree. I've taken 4 long skewers and some florist tape in brown. And I just go part way up those skewers. Then I take my secateurs and I cut 3 of those skewers down, leaving 1 long. Take the tape the rest of the way up and pop it into a styrofoam dummy for support. I'm now taking some brown fondant and wrapping it around the base. Cut off the excess, give it a roll, and pop it back into the styrofoam. Now I take teardrop shapes and place them around the base of the trunk to make roots, putting the thicker end against the trunk and the thinner end pointing outwards. Tree trunk's done. Now to make the top of the tree, I've taken a piece of green fondant and wrapped it over a styrofoam ball. Just squashing it all the way down, make the ball of fondant about the same size, if not slightly larger than the ball you're covering. Work it all the way down and roll it up. You'll need to do that 4 times. Now I'm squashing 3 together so that I can make a little bit of an impression in the base, you can see there, so I know where to stick my toothpicks. That one matches in right there. A little bit like fondant ball Lego. With the third one that you attach, of course, it's got to attach to 2 balls, so it needs 2 skewers. Push that in where the impression marks meet. And it looks like a little green molecule that we'll now place on top of the base. With the 4th, I just place that on top with a little bit of water, add a focus again, and that's the base of the tree. I rolled out some more of the same coloured green fondant and cut out some tiny little leaves with a rose leaf cutter, and then I attached them from the base upwards. Once again, this looks like it took forever, but it didn't take that long and I found it quite therapeutic. Either that or I'm nuts. I don't know. Probably a bit of both. Therapy, nuts. Of course, you want to go ahead and do that to all 4. I then just rolled out little circles of red fondant and made a dip in the top of them and made them slightly thinner in the bottom and placed them on each of those little balls for apples. Cute little apples. And afterthought was to make a little garden, so I've rolled out a darker piece of the terracotta fondant and put 3 strips of piping gel straight through that piece. I went in lightly at first and tried to be careful, but it was completely not worth it, so these are just some crushed Oreos that I've placed over the top and flattened down. flip it up, and the Oreos will stick to where you've put the piping gel and not to the rest. Well, mostly not to the rest. I just used a paintbrush to tidy it up. I had to fill the garden. Once again, it's a little bit out of focus. I apologize, it was so tiny. So I've rolled a small oval of green fondant, and I've taken some darker green gel color and made sort of squiggly lines all the way around that piece. We're making watermelons, by the way. Once they were done, I took a dry brush and just sort of smudged it out. And I know you can't see properly, I'm sorry. Nothing went right, just nothing went right with this. But there you go, there's a watermelon. And then I just decided to make little sprouts for the garden, just 2 tiny little teardrop shaped pieces of green that I flattened down with a Dresden tool and squished together. Finally, the topper I've made out of foam core once again. I cut out a template of the topper I wanted, used that as a stencil and drew around it onto my foam core, cut around that with my craft knife, and then placed 2 skewers up into the foam underneath. I rolled out a piece of brown fondant that was big enough to cover that and placed it on top, attaching it with some piping gel. I cut the excess off the edges, then I flipped it over and smooth those edges over. I cut off the excess with my craft knife on the back. I gave it a quick steam, and I had used the same template to print out an edible image that I placed on top. And the topper was done. Now I'm going to tell you how I put this together. So to attach the tree, I firstly attached it to the board with just a little bit of green royal icing, and then I put a skewer right through that ball right there and pushed that into the side of the house so it was going nowhere. To do the little sign, I once again attached it with a little bit of royal icing, and those 2 little bushes there, they're holding it up. I actually attached the fence in exactly the same way. It's pretty obvious how I attached the garden, just with a little bit of water, and popped it on. And for the topper, I just popped those skewers into the top of the cake, and it sat beautifully. And there you go, guys, that is my Animal Crossing cake for my baby boy's 21st birthday. Well guys, I hope you really enjoyed this week's tutorial, even with my epic fails. Like I said at the top of this video, if you'd like to know how I created the little figurines that went onto this cake, just follow the link in the description below. This cake should not have been as much of a headache as it was, and if I'd prepared properly and followed my templates, everything would have been fine. So if you want to make it for yourself, just follow the templates that I'm providing for you, also linked in the description below, and everything will be okay. Well guys, thank you so much for joining me again this week. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you're informed every time I upload a new video. It was so good seeing you again, but now you've got to go, okay? You know why. You gotta go and get your cake on. I'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.